case at all plausible. And I'll say I generalize that to other things like that where there's evidence supporting a bunch of different theories. I don't think it's right that you reasonably get to pick. I think what you reasonably get to do is not believe them or suspend judgment, or not believe perhaps when there's lots of candidates. I don't pretend to refute it as you hear. Okay. So the uniqueness thesis and debates about it don't strike me as a fruitful way to sort of defend reasonable disagreements and avoid the skeptical conclusion. Here's another potential response to the argument. I'll call it the hard line. The hard line holds that in these cases of apparently reasonable disagreements, one side's reasonable and the other side's not. That's it. So if the uniqueness thesis is true, a body of evidence supports just one attitude. If people have the same evidence, yet they have competing beliefs, then at least one of them has an unjustified belief. There can't be reasonable disagreement, and presumably participants in disagreements shouldn't think that they're having a reasonable disagreement. The answers to Q1, my questions at the beginning, Q1 and Q2, are both no. The hardline response doesn't accept the skeptical argument. Hardliners can say that one side has it right, that is, that in each of these disputes where the evidence is shared, there's a proper conclusion to draw from the evidence. One side is drawing that conclusion. The person on that side is justified in that belief. The person on the other side is not. You could apply that readily to the example. So either Van Inwagen in the free will dispute that Van Inwagen discusses, one of them's justified, one of them's not. The arguments are better on one side or the other. End of story. So the skeptical argument fails. The skeptical conclusion is false. But that's not a defense of reasonable disagreement. It's denying that there are any, but it's avoiding the skeptical conclusion. That's one possible response. And I think what I'm going to do is not say a great deal more about that now because I'm using up a lot of time. Tom is going to talk about that in his response, and maybe in my reply I'll say a little bit more about it, so we'll see. But I'll just say my general take on it. My claim is that the information you have about your peer who thinks the evidence doesn't go the way you think it does acts as a defeater for whatever evidential support you initially had. So the original evidence you had includes whatever arguments or considerations you looked at and you thought favored your belief. After the exchange with the peer, whose judgment you in general trust and should trust, you learn that this other person doesn't see the evidence the same way. Lacking a good reason to think that the other person's making a mistake in this case, this strikes me as a defeater of the sort that undermines whatever justification you originally had. I don't have any decisive argument for this view, but it doesn't strike me as acceptable. Now, Tom's going to defend it, and so I'll let him do it, and then I'll say what little bit more I have to say about it. Okay, so that's one potential response, another potential response. Let's think about another possibility, another issue in connection with the skeptical argument. There's something admittedly unrealistic about the discussion so far. It's turned on the idea of people sharing all their evidence. There's at least two ways in which, in any realistic case, the evidence isn't all shared. The first way in which evidence is not fully shared is suggested by something Van Inwagen says. He doesn't put things quite the way I will, but it looks like he says Van Inwagen, he and David Lewis shared their evidence about free will matters, but then he says this, and this is on the handout. I'm inclined to think that the evidence and arguments I can adduce in support of my beliefs do not constitute the totality of my justification for these beliefs. In an effort to explain how this could be, he writes, and this too is on the handout, I suppose my best guess is that I enjoy some sort of philosophical insight that for all his merits is somehow denied to Lewis. And this would have to be an insight that is incommunicable. At least I don't know how to communicate it. I've done all I can to communicate it to Lewis, and he has understood perfectly everything I have said, and he has not come to share my conclusions. Rosen says something quite similar. Instead of talking about insight, he talks of the obviousness of the proposition. And others might talk of how what seems clearly true. Rosen writes, and I guess I should preface this, he's discussing an example where you're having an encounter with, he calls it the other. And the other is a person who thinks cruelty is ethically good. So, and he writes, if the obviousness of the contested claim survives the encounter with the other, then one still has some reason to hold that contested claim, the reason provided by the seeming. If, after reflecting on the rational tenability of an ethos that prizes cruelty, cruelty continues to strike me as self-evidently reprehensible, then my conviction that it is reprehensible has a powerful and cogent ground, despite my recognition that others who lack this ground may be fully justified in thinking otherwise. One could say that the special insight that Van Inwagen mentions, or the seeming obviousness that Rosen mentions, is a non-evidential factor that affects justification. But I won't think of it that way. I think this is terminological, but maybe not. In any case, I'm going to take it that it's seeming clear, you're having this insight constitutes evidence. And then what you might say is that the truth in D, the proposition in the argument describing the cases of disagreement, the truth is that the parties to the dispute have shared what we might call all their public or communicable evidence, but they haven't shared all their evidence. People who share their public evidence can differ with respect to their private evidence, the insights, the seemings in their own head. But then, you might looking at the argument again, you might say, if people who have shared if principle E is about public evidence, then from the fact that you've shared all your public evidence, it doesn't follow that your overall evidence doesn't support your belief, because your private evidence might tip it in your favor. Or another way to think about things is to say, well, D is just false. People never really share all their evidence. They only share their public evidence. So however exactly you think about these things, the argument for F fails. There can be things pretty close to reasonable disagreement. There can be cases in which people have shared all the public evidence. Their private seemings are different, so they have different justified beliefs. Their total bodies of evidence diverge, and so even evidentialism is preserved. Appealing as this response may be, I don't think it will do. Let's use the dispute between Lewis and Van Inwagen as the example. I think that we'll all agree that everything that Van Inwagen said about his case, Lewis could have said from his side. That is, Lewis could equally well have claimed that a special insight justified his belief. I suppose that one could deny that the case goes this way, but I find that completely mysterious. And I think Van Inwagen agrees. In a brief discussion of disputes that he finds unlike those that are his main focus, he mentions astrology. He thinks that someone who believes in astrology believes in something that is just indefensible. But in rejecting in the same way the views of those who dispute the central issues in philosophy, politics, and science is, he says, ludicrous. Now, saying that the beliefs of the others are not ludicrous is not the same as saying that they're justified. However, it's hard to see how the two people are not in comparable positions. And I think Rosen would agree. So, I mean, my idea is, the thought is that there's a kind of symmetry between Lewis's position and Van Inwagen's position on the free will debate. And on the other kinds of disputes we're looking at, there seems to be a kind of symmetry. Each person can say the same thing. But that doesn't commit us to saying the same is true if you're having a debate with somebody who believes in astrology or something like that. You might say there's some cases that are somehow different. And I don't have a principled way to say what are the cases where this is sort of worrisome and what are the cases when you can say, it's not a problem. So what's the difference between the free will case and the astrology case? I don't know. But it does seem like there's a difference. Okay, so let's think about the free will case again and imagine you have the insight. In order to think about that, let's consider a case of regular sight rather than insight. Suppose you and I are standing by the window looking out on the quad. We have comparable vision, know each other to be honest. I see what seems to me to look like the dean standing out in the middle of the quad. Assume this is not something odd. He's out there a fair amount, having nothing else to do. I believe that the dean is standing out on the quad. Meanwhile, you seem to see nothing of the kind there. You think that no one, and thus not the dean, is standing in the middle of the quad. We disagree. But suppose we haven't said anything to each other. That is, we're just standing there and sort of believing about what we see, what's out there, and nobody says anything. We're each reasonable. We're epistemic peers, or at least we have every reason to think that we're peers. There's no track record to lead us to think otherwise. Then, suppose I say something about the dean being on the quad, and we find out about our situation. You say, there's nobody out there. And I say, but I see him. In my view, once that happens, each of us should suspend judgment about whether the dean is out there. We know that something weird is going on, but we have no idea which one of us has the problem. I wouldn't be reasonable in thinking that the problem is in your head rather than mine. Similarly, I think Van Inwagen's situation is that his evidence is not exactly the same as Lewis's. Van Inwagen has his own insight about the free will issue, and Lewis has his. But Van Inwagen also knows that Lewis has such an insight. And and vice versa. Each knows that this insight has evidential force. And now I see no basis for either of them justifying his own belief simply because the one insight happens to occur inside of him. A point about evidence that plays a pivotal role here is this. Evidence of evidence is evidence. That is, evidence that there is evidence for P is evidence for P. Knowing that Lewis has his insight provides Van Inwagen with evidence. The point is not that one cannot justifiably maintain a belief when one admits that others have a justified belief in a competing proposition. One can, but only in cases of asymmetry. You might know more than the other person and be able to say of them that they're justified and nevertheless mistaken. So clearly asymmetrical cases can do that, but that's not the kind that we're in. So when one has one's own evidence supporting a proposition, knows that another person has comparable evidence supporting a competing proposition, that is a competing insight, and no reason to think that one's own reason is the non-defective one, I say you can't reasonably think, well, it's really seeming to me that my belief is true, so even though it seems to you that your competing belief is true, your appearance or seeming or insight is deceptive. I need some reason to think that you, rather than me, are the one with the problem. The detective needs a reason to think that, I'll skip that, I didn't do that example. Van Inwagen and Rosen need reasons to think that their own insights or seemings are accurate, rather than the other guy. To think otherwise is to think something like this. You have an insight according to which not P is true. I have one according to which P is true. It's reasonable for me to believe P in light of all of this because, gosh darn it, my insight supports P. If one's conviction survives the confrontation with the other, to use Rosen's phrase, this seems to me to be more a sign of tenacity and stubbornness than anything else. If these insights and seemings make an evidential difference, it can't be that the mere fact that one of them happens to be mine makes that difference. Thus, I can't see how the special insights help. More precisely, I can't see how they help if it's granted that the other people on the other side of the issue are having comparable insights. Then there's insights on both sides and the evidence is balanced out. And I don't see any basis in the cases we're looking at for denying that they do have comparable insights. Thus, even if we have insights, or seemings or whatever, and these count as evidence, and this shows that evidence is never completely shared, I don't see how the problem is avoided. The kind of supplemental evidence about the other person's insight seems to just reinstate the problem. We have such similar bodies of evidence, I don't see how you get to stick to your guns. I've gone on too long, so I'm gonna skip to some conclusions. I was going to talk about one other point about background beliefs and a point about externalist epistemological theories and what difference they make, but the answer was they didn't help. So I'll skip that, and I'll draw some conclusions. I haven't found a good response to the argument for F. I think that E and C or similar close cousins to those principles are true. I feel pretty confident that there can't be acknowledged reasonable disagreements. That is, I think that the answer to question 2 is no. You can't reasonably think that other view is reasonable, but mine is reasonable and I'm right and they're wrong, and sort of you can't just get that whole package. So what my students most wanted, I think they can't get. I think that the answer to Q1 is also no, though I'm a little bit less confident of that. It just, I guess I stick to the idea that, well, the evidence has to go either one way or the other, and I think that under the relevant conditions, it's often neutral. I think the existence of disagreement does make an epistemic difference. That is, sometimes learning of a disagreement with a peer involves learning that there's evidence on the other side of an issue, and this can really matter. I think the idea that we actually do have real disagreements in a lot of cases of apparent disagreement deserves closer scrutiny than I've given it. That is, some real-world disagreements and some philosophical disagreements are really cases of people talking past one another, using terms in different ways, and not real disagreements. And so that needs to be factored in, and I haven't talked about that today, and I don't know what fraction of the cases that might deal with. But I am more of a skeptic than others, such as Van Inwagen. In fact, like many people, I'm often shaken when I learn of disagreement. I don't really have such confident views about a lot of topics. Or if I do have such views, I don't actually think they're justified. It's an epistemic failing on my part to have those confident attitudes. I think suspending judgment is often the right attitude, and people don't do it enough. More often, I think it's the right attitude far more often than many others do, and certainly more than how they practice. I don't see a threat to evidentialism in any of this, and finally, I'm sure that reasonable people could disagree with all of these conclusions. Thanks.